Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi just secured a landslide historic victory in Japan's snap election for the lower house. Her Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, didn't just win. It achieved a 2/3 supermajority in the lower house of the National Diet, the largest gain for a single party in Japan's post-war history. It was a massive political gamble for her, and it paid off spectacularly. So what does this powerful new mandate mean for Japan and its relationship with the United States and with China? Hi, I'm Kiyoteru Tsutsui, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford University. Welcome to APARC Briefing, where we analyze pressing issues and emerging new developments in Asian affairs and US-Asia relations. Today, let's unpack what just happened in Japan over the last weekend. First, the context. Why did this election take place? Now let's go back to the fall. Takaichi first won the LDP presidential election. Somewhat of a surprise for a lot of observers. She beat very strong Shinjiro Koizumi to become LDP's president. And then she had to get appointed as prime minister in the Diet. But then she lost 26-year-long coalition partner, Komeito. And that was quite hard. Okay? But she quickly formed an alliance with a new partner, Ishin, the Innovation Party. Okay? And that was enough for her to secure the prime ministership. And she got elected 4 months ago as prime minister. She had a relatively weak power base, though, in the Diet because it was a minority ruling coalition, not a majority. So any laws that had to pass in the Diet had to be negotiated with opposition parties. It was a difficult management of the Diet. Despite that, her popularity soared as soon as she took office, basically. And she was riding on 60%, 70%, close to 80% approval rate. Okay? And yet, she did not have to call a snap election in January. Calling this election was seen as a gamble because the LDP's approval rate, hovering still around 30%, was not very strong. So this was an election really for her to lose. And she called the election probably because internal polling by the LDP, which is seen as quite accurate in the past, and when LDP prime ministers called the election, they often delivered a victory. But this one probably was more of a gamble because she did not really consult with a lot of people. She allegedly talked with only one advisor to call this election. And she really made it a referendum on her. She proclaimed that she will step down if she doesn't win a majority in the lower house. And during the campaign, she turned it into more like a presidential election and talking about how the public should choose between her as prime minister or the opposition leaders, naming them as prime minister. That is a new approach, relatively, to the Japanese election, considering that it's a parliamentary system. And after calling this election, she faced a new challenge of a newly emerging partnership between the Constitutional Democratic Party, the largest opposition party, and Komeito. As I said, Komeito was LDP's partner for 26 years. And now Komeito is moving to the Constitutional Democratic Party, forming a new party called Centrist Reform Alliance. And that seemed quite powerful, especially with the election coming in winter season, where when it snows a lot and it's cold and people don't want to go out. And their mobilizing capacity seemed quite formidable because Komeito is backed by a religious group and the Constitutional Democratic Party is backed by unions. So that made it seem like Takaichi's gamble might fail. But the result was a resounding victory for Takaichi and the LDP. LDP secured 316 seats. 310 is the 2/3 majority. It exceeded that number for the first time in post-war history. As a side note, LDP actually, in terms of the votes, number of votes, LDP won 330 seats, 14 more than it actually had seats. That is because of the proportional representation system, which is organized at the regional level. And LDP did not list enough names on that list because it did not think that it would win that much. So if LDP had filled all the slots, then we would be talking about LDP having 330 seats today. Okay? Those 14 seats were literally left on the table and were distributed to other opposition parties. So 316 for LDP, 36 for Ishin, the Innovation Party. The ruling coalition now has 352 seats. That's an amazing number. So it was a huge victory for Takaichi. Now, why did it happen? The two key factors people point out. One is Takaichi's popularity. It's really her personal brand of plain-spoken, straight-shooting style, coming from middle-class roots, not from political dynasties, like many of the previous prime ministers who had their parents and their grandparents also as politicians. And she is obviously the first female prime minister. And her communication style resonated in the era of YouTube and TikTok and all these shortcuts. Her style really fit that. And she had popularity among young, urban, Gen Z people, voters, as well as old, rural, more conservative people. So she had a very strong supporters across different demographic backgrounds. Her hard-working style, she demonstrated that she is going to walk, and she delivered. She allegedly sleeps somewhere around 2, 3, 4 hours every night and just focus on her walk. Okay? A lot of people who interact with her in policy discussions are impressed by how much she actually reads all these documents that other politicians would just have bureaucrats discuss. This vote, I think, is more on her promise than actual accomplishments. But to be fair, in the last 4 months, she has accomplished quite a bit. She has passed some new legislation to address the really pending cost of living crisis. Inflation is high, and she passed laws to reduce gasoline tax, to reduce the utility bills. All these things are appreciated. On the diplomatic stage, she did quite well. She hosted President Trump to Tokyo with much success. She hosted Italy's Prime Minister Meloni and formed a strong bond, seemingly. And she hosted President Lee of South Korea and had a famous drumming session playing to the tunes of Demon Hunter song. And that played particularly well on TV, on media, and especially to young generations. And she performed well in international conference, international gatherings, such as APEC, ASEAN meetings, and G20 summit meeting. Now the second factor, big factor, is the opposition just collapsed. As I said, when it was formed, the centrist reform alliance looked reasonably good, but it was quite hastily formed, and it was a muddled merger. And in the end, two heads of the former parties, Constitutional Democratic Parties, Noda and Komero's Saito, became the two heads, co-heads of the new coalition. And that didn't look good. They seemed like old dinosaurs, old Japanese men represent older generations of Japanese politics. And that did not play well, especially in contrast to Takaichi's fresh female face. And very symbolically, in this election, a lot of former leaders of the Democratic Party of Japan who went into the Constitutional Democratic Party, who were in the cabinet in the period 2009 to 12 when the Democratic Party of Japan was the ruling party, a lot of them actually lost this election, and they are no longer politicians. So in the end, voters looking at Takaichi's fresh promise and looking at the opposition party's sort of weakness, they decided that they would go for Takaichi and voted in massive landslide election result. What does this strong new mandate mean for Takaichi and LDP? In terms of domestic policy, this 2/3 majority means that if the lower house passes a law it goes to the upper house. Now, upper house is a different beast. LDP does not, and the coalition does not have a majority there. So if it goes to the upper house, it could get rejected. But then most of the legislation come back to the lower house. And with 2/3 majority, those legislations could be passed. So if Takaichi wants to push her agenda, she could make that happen in this way. Although prime ministers, ruling parties typically do not want to use that very often. But for a critical issue, critical legislation, she could use that. I think she will focus on the economic agenda and delivering lower cost of living for the Japanese public. That's what the public wants. That was the number one issue, and that's what she's going to try to deliver. She ran on a platform of responsible and proactive fiscal policy, promising reduction of consumption tax for food items that matters to people the most. Now we will see how that will play out, because that would add to the national debt and potentially screw up the market. She'll be watching very carefully the long-term interest rate. If it goes too high, that's a sign that Takaichi might have to adjust, because a massive increase in the rising government debt would lead to lack of trust in the government's finance, leading to the higher interest rate, long-term interest rate. So she will try to avoid the kind of the shock, like a trust shock in UK, and try to manage the expectation. Okay. So we will see whether the consumption tax for food items gets reduced, or more like cash handouts might be the better approach. But she will focus on economic agenda with lowering the cost of living, as well as investing in stimulus and industrial policy. She already laid out 17 areas such as AI, quantum computing, supply chains, resilience, and so on. Okay, she will invest further in those areas. That's domestic policy. In terms of Japan's democracy, okay, does this mean the return of LDP dominance? That's possible, but the lower house electoral system is set up in such a way that the wind could blow in the other direction, and LDP could face a massive defeat in the next election. Now, opposition parties really have to take a look at themselves in the mirror and decide how to recover from this monumental loss. But things could go quickly in the other direction if the economy doesn't improve, or if Prime Minister Takaichi fumbles on some key issues. One thing to note in this election is that a couple of smaller parties emerged and gained a lot of seats. One is Sanseito, which is known to have a very strong anti-immigrant streak and a conservative bent, and that party gained 15 seats in this election. And then there's also a party called Team Future, Team Mirai, which runs on a sort of digital democracy platform. A lot of their candidates are very young, and they gained 11 seats. They had no seats in the lower house, now they have 11. Okay, so they grew quite a bit. Okay. So there is a desire on the part of the Japanese voters to find these new alternatives. Now, some might look at the rise of Sanseido and the victory of LDP to think that Japan is kind of moving toward the right. That's not necessarily entirely true, because a lot of people projected that the Sanseido would win many more seats, 20, 30, even 40 seats in this election. They did win, but they only won 15. So how to interpret that is an interesting question. And the Conservative Party, which is even more conservative, more hardline against immigration, they did not win any seats. So I don't see Japan as moving very far to the right. It's just that the current policies toward immigration are not very popular, and the public does want to see it addressed. Now, with this powerful mandate, 2/3 majority, constitutional amendment is also on the table. The party needs 2/3 majority to pass that, and then it's a national referendum. Takaichi still doesn't have that in the upper house, but she does have that in the lower house. So there will be continuing discussion. But that's something probably not on the immediate horizon. She will prepare for that, she will discuss that, and she doesn't have to face an national election for a few years. So she will prepare for that. And if she wins another landslide victory in the next upper house election, then constitutional amendment becomes even more realistic. Foreign policy. So confronting China has been an issue, and Takaichi not backing down on China's coercive pressure to retract her statement about Taiwan contingency worked, and she will likely continue on. But she never sought a fight with China. Even when she made the statement in the Diet, it was not meant to provoke China. And she will continue, I think, to restrain from making provocative comments to China. She's known as a straight shooter, so sometimes she might make some kind of statements that would provoke China, but I don't think she would try that, at least. How would China react to that? I think China now has to respect Takaichi as a strong leader of Japan. But that does not mean that China would back down and somewhat become conciliatory all of a sudden. That is unlikely. So it will take a while. This tango will continue on. And I think it ultimately depends on China-US relations. President Trump and President Xi, they're expected to meet 4 times this year. And the outcome of that might be a cozy, warm relation. They might start exchanging love letters. Or something might happen and they get pissed off at each other and things flare up between the two countries. Now, if US-China relations deteriorate, then that's when China is very likely to reach out to Japan. And that's exactly what happened during the Abe administration. China was really upset when Abe visited the Yasukuni Shrine in 2013. It took years, really, for the relationship between Japan and China to normalize after that. But it is when US-China tension rose that China reached out to Abe and tried to improve relationships with Japan. So China-US relations will likely shape China-Japan relations. US-Japan alliance, I think will continue to be strong, maybe even stronger. As we all know, President Trump likes winners, and Prime Minister Takaichi has proven to be a big winner. There will be a summit meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Takaichi in March, and I can already see President Trump talking up Prime Minister Takaichi as the biggest winner in Japan's history, and that really plays well. So the relationship will go reasonably well on the personal level. Now, there are other tense issues between Japan and the US as well, such as the tariffs and the promised massive investment coming from Japan to the United States. Those issues will be discussed, and President Trump might want more immediate result, especially on the investment front. But in terms of security, they're on the same page. President Trump wants Japan to increase defense budget. Prime Minister Takaichi wants to increase defense budget. Prime Minister Takaichi will revise the 3 security documents this year, and then that would also lead to a more of a shoring up of Japan's defense. So on that front, they're all on the same page. I want to talk a little bit more about the mandate Prime Minister Takaichi has. In addition to the election outcome, we conduct the Stanford Japan Barometer survey, and we just did it over the weekend in early February, and the result gives a lot of support to Takaichi's policy agenda. For instance, on her comment about Taiwan contingency that really upset China, more than 60% of the Japanese public support that she not retract her statement. That's a very powerful support for her. On defense, 52% support defense budget increase. And a lot of them, I'm sure, are aware that that would strain Japan's budget situation. But even there, more than 50% support defense budget increase. Where the money should come from for that defense budget increase, there's a divergent opinion. But there's support for defense increase, defense spending increase. For US-Japan alliance, more than 80% of the Japanese public support the US-Japan alliance. So on foreign policy, she has a pretty strong mandate and support from the public. I would also like to note that in the Japan Barometer, we ask public's views about other issues. And what's interesting is that on social issues that Prime Minister Takaichi might not touch on, there's also support for something like same-sex marriage or married couples, especially married women, keeping their surnames. There's more than 50% support from the Japanese voters for those issues. So Prime Minister Takaichi might be wise to think about how to address those concerns that the Japanese public has. especially since she has strong conservative credentials and is not likely to lose the support of the conservative wing of the LDP, even if she supports these left-leaning policies. Much like Prime Minister Abe, with his conservative credentials, was able to pass left-leaning laws such as Hate Speech Elimination Act and Black Discrimination Law. In sum, Takaichi has a strong mandate. She has the power base in the Diet to get things done. And now everybody, the Japanese public and the world outside, they're watching her moves and checking if she can deliver on her promises to strengthen the Japanese economy, to navigate a tense relationship with China, a more broader sort of complicated international scene that we're witnessing today. Thank you. This has been APARC Briefing. If you have any questions or comments, please write them down on the comment section. Thank you for joining, and see you next time at the next APARC Briefing episode.